The golden chandeliers of the Naval Academy ballroom reflected off my U.S. Navy dress whites, but the air turned ice cold the moment my father, Victor Whitlock, grabbed the microphone. This was my wedding, a room filled with 250 elite officers and legendary SEALs, and he chose this moment to gut me. The jazz band died out as he let out a jagged, mocking laugh. Rachel spent her life playing soldier draped in medals she probably begged for. He sneered, his voice booming through the speakers. But let's be honest. To the world, she's a commander. To me, she's just a failure of a daughter who never learned her place was in a kitchen, not a cockpit. A few relatives snickered. The rest of the room froze in suffocating secondary shame. My husband Ethan reached for my hand, but I stood paralyzed, my knuckles white against my champagne glass. Then the double doors crashed open. The music vanished. A roar shattered the silence. Admiral on deck. Before I tell you what happened after my father tried to humiliate me at my own wedding, if stories about family betrayal, earned respect, and quiet justice resonate with you, consider liking and subscribing. To understand why my father felt comfortable gutting me in front of 250 guests at my own wedding, you have to understand the soil I was raised in. I grew up in Jacksonville, North Carolina, a town where the air smells like Atlantic salt and gun oil. We lived in the long, imposing shadow of Marine Corps Camp Lejeune. In Jacksonville, you aren't just a citizen. You are either a Marine related to a Marine or out of place. My father, Victor Whitlock, was a retired Marine captain. To him, the world was a series of tactical objectives, and human value was measured solely by military discipline. He didn't just live the code, he enforced it within our four walls like a commanding officer presiding over a hostile territory. Every morning at 500, the lights in our house flickered on. There were no lazy Saturdays. There was only the Whitlock standard. From the moment my older brother Travis could walk, he was being forged as the heir apparent. Dad treated him like a recruit in an elite pipeline. They spent their weekends at the range cleaning rifles or running 5-mile rucks through the humid Carolina brush. Travis was the chosen one, the warfighter. The one destined to carry the Whitlock name back into the fire of combat. And then, there was me. While Travis was being taught how to lead men and master ballistics, I was being drafted into a very different kind of service. My training took place in the kitchen and the laundry room. My father's philosophy was archaic and unyielding. A woman's contribution to the family's honor was her invisibility. I was taught to cook the perfect medium-rare steak for his poker nights with fellow officers. I was taught to scrub the floorboards until they shone like a fresh lieutenant's bars. Most importantly, I was taught the art of silence, the virtue of keeping my mouth shut when the men were talking about real-world issues. I remember the exact moment the tectonic plates of my life shifted. It was my 13th birthday. We were hosting a backyard barbecue for a group of my father's old Marine buddies. The air was thick with the smell of charcoal and the loud, boisterous laughter of men who believed they owned the horizon. One of the officers looked at Travis and asked about his plans for the academy. Travis puffed out his chest, reciting his goals with practiced precision. Then, for a fleeting second, the officer's eyes landed on me. "And what about you, little Rachel? You going to find yourself a nice lieutenant to take care of?" I felt a sudden sharp heat in my chest, a fire that had been smoldering under years of household chores. I looked my father directly in the eye, my voice steady, despite the trembling in my knees. "No, sir. I'm going to be a naval officer. I'm going to Annapolis." The silence that followed wasn't respectful. It was mocking. My father paused, a beer in one hand and a spatula in the other. He didn't get angry, not yet. Instead, he let out a low, condescending chuckle that cut deeper than any shout. He turned to his friends, gesturing toward me as if I were a performing pet. "You hear that, boys?" he sneered. "Rachel thinks she's a hero. She thinks she's going to trade her apron for a flight suit." He stepped closer to me, his shadow looming over my small frame. "Listen to me, girl. Daughters in this house don't go to the battlefield. You're built for the home, not the hull of a ship. Don't let your imagination get ahead of your abilities." Travis laughed a cruel, sycophantic sound that mimicked our father's. I stood there rooted to the spot watching the two most important men in my life dismiss my existence as a joke. I felt small, but inside that smallness something hardened into steel. The only reason I didn't break that night was my mother Helen. She was a literature teacher, soft-spoken, observant, and possessed of a strength my father was too blind to recognize. Later that evening, as I sat on the back porch staring at the North Carolina stars, she sat down beside me. She didn't offer a loud defense or a fiery speech. She just took my hand. "They don't see it yet, Rachel." She whispered, her voice a calm anchor in the wake of my father's storm. "But I do. You have a fire in you that doesn't need to roar to be felt. I call you my quiet storm." She leaned in closer, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Remember this. You don't have to scream to change the world. The strongest winds are often the ones no one hears coming until it's too late to stop them. Let them laugh. Just keep moving." That night, the quiet storm began to gather. My father thought he had put me in my place. In reality, he had just given me a target. By the time I reached my senior year of high school, the quiet storm my mother spoke of had become a hurricane of ambition. While my classmates were planning beach trips and picking out prom dresses, I was obsessing over my fitness scores and the grueling application process for the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. In our house, the atmosphere was suffocating. My father and Travis operated like a two-man unit, intentionally leaving an empty chair at the table during their tactical discussions. I was a ghost in my own home, a domestic servant who happened to be a straight-A student. I didn't care. I had meticulously gathered my letters of recommendation, completed my physical assessments, and prepared my personal essays. 2 weeks before the deadline, I walked to the post office and mailed my thick application packet, feeling the weight of my entire future in that envelope. Then came the silence. 1 week before the final cutoff, I hadn't heard a word. Driven by a gut feeling, the kind of intuition that later saved lives in combat, I called the admissions office at Annapolis. "I'm calling to check the status of the application for Rachel Whitlock." I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. There was a pause, the sound of typing, and then the words that felt like a physical blow to the stomach. "I'm sorry, Miss Whitlock, but we have no record of an application under that name. The file is empty." I felt the blood drain from my face. I had mailed it. I had the receipt. I checked the tracking. It had been delivered to our local outgoing mail hub, but then it seemed to have vanished. Panicked and reeling, I didn't have time to investigate. I had 7 days. I spent the next 144 hours in a fever dream, rewriting every essay from memory, hunting down my teachers for duplicate recommendations, and overnighting a second desperate packet. I was accepted. Against all odds, the gates of Annapolis opened for me. When the thick acceptance envelope arrived, I placed it on the dining table during dinner. My mother wept with joy, her hand trembling as she touched the crest. My father didn't even look up from his plate. He didn't offer a congratulations. He didn't even offer a good job. Instead, he stood up, pushed his chair back with a screech that set my teeth on edge, and walked out of the room. He didn't speak to me for 3 months. The day of my high school graduation was a sea of blue caps and proud parents. As I sat in the front row, I kept glancing back at the seat next to my mother. It remained stubbornly, cruelly empty. Travis was there, leaning against a wall in the back, looking bored. But the seat labeled Victor Whitlock was a void. I walked across that stage to accept my diploma with a smile plastered on my face, but inside I was learning a bitter lesson. My father's love was a resource that had been permanently decommissioned. The first 2 years at Annapolis were a blur of plebe summer sleep deprivation and the relentless pressure of the most elite training in the world. Despite the distance, a small naive part of me, the little girl who used to watch him clean his medals, still hoped. I wrote home every Sunday. I told him about the discipline, the navigation courses, and how I was ranking in the top 5% of my class. I wanted him to see that I was a Whitlock. I wanted him to see that I had the steel he valued so much. I never received a single reply. My mother's letters were my only lifeline, filled with snippets of home and her fading strength. Then in my second year, the storm turned dark. My mother was diagnosed with an aggressive form of stage 4 cancer. The quiet storm was losing her anchor. I spent every leave period by her bedside, watching the woman who taught me to be strong wither away. When she finally passed, I was back at the academy preparing for midterm exams. I didn't get a phone call from my father. I didn't get a letter of shared grief. I got a 3-line email. Subject: Mother, funeral Friday, 1100 hours. Don't wear your uniform. You've embarrassed this family enough with that costume. VW. The words, "that costume," burned into my retina. He wanted me to show up as the submissive daughter he could still control, the one who would hide her achievements to protect his fragile ego. On the day of the funeral, I stood in front of the mirror in my cramped dorm room. I looked at my Navy service dress blues, the sharp creases, the polished brass, and the midshipman stripes that I had bled for. I didn't reach for a black dress. I arrived at the cemetery in full uniform. As I walked toward the casket, the wind whipping my coat, I saw my father's face turn a shade of purple I had never seen before. His jaw tightened so hard I thought it might snap. He looked at me not with grief for his wife, but with pure, unadulterated hatred for the soldier I had become. I stood at the grave, back straight, eyes fixed on the horizon. I wasn't just there to bury my mother. I was there to bury the version of myself that still cared what he thought. After burying my mother, I returned to Annapolis with a heart made of flint. If I thought the hostility at home was a localized storm, the reality of the fleet was a cold, systemic front. At that time, women made up barely 17% of the brigade of midshipmen. We weren't just a minority, we were an anomaly to the old guard who still believed the deck plates were no place for a woman. The prejudice wasn't always loud like my father's. Often it was a quiet, suffocating dismissal. During tactical simulations, while my male peers were assigned to lead fire teams or navigate high-speed maneuvers, I found myself being handed a clipboard. "Whitlock, you've got the best handwriting, stick to the logs," one instructor told me, his eyes never meeting mine. I remember a specific night during a grueling field exercise. The rain was turning the Maryland soil into a soul-crushing sludge. We were exhausted, shivering, and pushed to our limits. A senior officer, a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite, pulled me aside after I had finished a 12-mile ruck. He didn't look impressed. He looked annoyed. "Why are you wasting our time?" "Whitlock?" he asked, leaning in so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You're a high performer, sure. But women don't last in special operations. You'll hit a wall, a physical one, a mental one, or a social one, and you'll break. You're taking a spot from a man who belongs here." I didn't blink. I didn't argue. I had learned from my mother that the quiet storm doesn't waste energy on thunder. It just destroys the landscape. From that day forward, I stopped trying to be as good as the men. I decided to be twice as good. While my classmates were at the midshipman tavern or sleeping, I was in the library memorizing the technical specifications of every weapon system in the arsenal. I spent hours in the dark practicing blindfolded weapon assembly until my fingers bled. In the gym, I didn't just meet the female physical standards, I crushed the male ones. I pushed myself until I could run 1.5 miles in under 9 minutes and perform 20 dead hang pull-ups without breaking a sweat. I became a walking encyclopedia of tactical procedures. If an instructor asked a question about unconventional warfare or maritime interdiction, my hand was the first one up, and my answer was always flawless. I was no longer just the girl. I was Commander Whitlock, a tactical asset that became impossible to ignore. Years of grit and deployments in the Middle East followed. I worked my way through the ranks, proving my worth in environments where a single mistake meant a body bag. Eventually, the impossible happened. I was selected as a liaison officer for Naval Special Warfare Command (NSWC). It was a prestigious high-stakes role usually reserved for the Boys Club veteran SEALs or career surface warriors with decades of grit. It was the ultimate validation of my skill set. I was the bridge between the high-level strategists and the elite operators on the ground. In a moment of weakness, or perhaps a final lingering spark of hope, I decided to reach out one last time. I had just been promoted to lieutenant commander. I took a photo of myself in my new shoulder board standing in front of the SEAL Trident at Coronado. I didn't write a long, emotional letter. I just wrote, "I'm where you said I could never be." Rachel. I mailed it to my father's house in Jacksonville. 2 weeks later, a familiar envelope appeared in my military mailbox. My heart skipped a beat as I saw the handwriting. But as I turned it over, I felt a familiar cold void open in my chest. The envelope hadn't even been opened. Across my name in thick, aggressive red ink were the stamped words, "Return to sender." Underneath the stamp in my father's unmistakable, rigid handwriting, he had added, "No such person lives here." I stood in the dusty California sun staring at that red ink. It was the final kill shot to my childhood. My father didn't just disagree with my career. He had erased my very existence because I had dared to succeed in his world. That was the moment I finally understood the recognition I had been chasing was a phantom. My family wasn't waiting for me at the finish line. They weren't even in the race. I was alone, but as I looked at the medals on my chest, I realized I was also free. By 2016, the red ink of my father's rejection had dried, leaving behind a cold, professional clarity. I didn't need his pride. I needed results. That year, I found myself stationed off the Horn of Africa, serving as the tactical coordinator for a high-stakes hostage rescue mission. The target was a merchant vessel held by Somali pirates, but the intelligence was flawed. What was supposed to be a surgical strike turned into a chaotic meat grinder the moment our boys hit the surf. A specialized SEAL team was tasked with the beach extraction. As they approached the shoreline under the cloak of a moonless night, the coast erupted. It wasn't just small arms fire, it was a coordinated ambush. RPGs streaked across the dark sky, and heavy machine gun fire tore through the air. Within minutes, the radio chatter turned frantic. "Contact heavy resistance. We have 2 operators down, multiple gunshot wounds. We need immediate case evac." The rescue helicopter, a modified Seahawk, attempted to swoop in for the pickup, but a lucky shot from an insurgent's anti-aircraft gun clipped its tail rotor. The bird managed to limp away and crash land in a green zone miles away, leaving the SEAL team pinned down against a crumbling seawall with their backs to the ocean. They were bleeding out, outgunned, and running out of time. If we didn't get them off that beach in the next 20 minutes, there wouldn't be anyone left to save. I was stationed on a support destroyer 5 miles offshore watching the thermal feeds. The commanding officers in the Combat Information Center were debating the risks of sending in a second bird into an active kill zone without suppressed fire. They were talking about acceptable losses and strategic withdrawal. I felt the quiet storm inside me break its banks. I didn't ask for permission. I grabbed my gear and headed for the flight deck, where a small, nimble utility chopper was prepping for a secondary logistics run. "I'm taking over tactical coordination from the air," I told the pilot. "We're going into the hot zone." As we crossed the shoreline, the world turned into a strobe light of explosions. The insurgents had deployed localized electronic jammers, turning our sophisticated comms into a wall of static. The team on the ground couldn't hear the coordinates for the secondary extraction point. They were blind. I leaned out of the open door of the chopper, the humid Somali air whipping my hair, the smell of cordite filling my lungs. I grabbed the flare gun and signaled the team below with a series of rhythmic bursts, old-school naval signaling that no jammer could touch. Then I keyed the short-range encrypted radio screaming over the roar of the engine. Viking lead. This is Whitlock. I am your eye in the sky. Shift your fire to the 11 o'clock position. Move toward the rocky outcrop. We are bringing the extraction craft to you. Through the static, a voice crackled back. Exhausted, incredulous, and strained with the effort of dragging a wounded teammate. It was the team leader. Whitlock, ma'am. What are you doing? You're a liaison officer. You're not supposed to be here. I looked down at the chaos below, the flashes of muzzles, the blood on the sand, and the brotherhood that my father claimed I could never understand. I didn't hesitate. Neither are they, Master Chief, I snapped back. Now move your ass to the extraction point before I come down there and carry you myself. For the next 10 minutes, I directed the suppression fire from the destroyer's deck guns, threading the needle between our men and the enemy. I guided the backup extraction boats through the treacherous reefs, using my vantage point to spot the hidden RPG nests before they could fire. I stayed in the air until the last SEAL was pulled from the water, until the last wounded man was stabilized on a stretcher. When we finally touched down back on the destroyer, I was covered in salt spray and grease. My uniform was a mess and my ears were ringing. As I stepped off the helipad, a massive shadow blocked my path. It was Master Chief Logan Mercer, a man whose name was whispered with reverence in the SEAL community. He was a mountain of a man currently drenched in the blood of his brothers, whom he had just hauled to safety. He looked at me for a long time, his eyes searching mine. I expected a lecture on protocol or a reprimand for leaving my post. Instead, he took off his tactical glove and extended a calloused, steady hand. "Commander," he said, his voice like grinding gravel. "They told us you were just here to push papers and manage schedules. They were wrong. You didn't just run the mission tonight, Whitlock. You saved it. Those 2 men in the med bay, they're going home because of you." I shook his hand, and for the first time in my life, I felt the weight of a family that actually valued me. It wasn't the one I was born into, but it was the one I had earned. A year before the wedding that would eventually shatter what remained of our family ties, I returned to Jacksonville. My mother had left her small private property, a cottage filled with the scent of old books and dried lavender, to me in her will. It was her final act of rebellion against my father's dominance. To move forward with my life with Ethan, I needed to close that chapter, which meant cleaning out the house and putting it on the market. The attic was a graveyard of memories, thick with dust and the oppressive heat of a North Carolina summer. I spent hours sorting through boxes of old textbooks and photo albums, my heart aching with every relic of my mother's quiet storm life. Tucked away in the darkest corner behind a stack of my father's old marine trunks, I found a small dented tin box. I expected to find old tax returns or perhaps my mother's jewelry. Instead, when I pried the lid open, I found a single official-looking envelope. The logo in the top left corner sent a chill down my spine: United States Naval Academy Office of Admissions. The postmark was dated 14 years ago. My breath hitched. This was the original response to my first application, the one that the Academy told me they had never received. The envelope had been crudely sliced open at the top. With trembling hands, I pulled out the letter. "Dear Ms. Whitlock, we are pleased to inform you that your preliminary application has been reviewed and found to be highly competitive." The letter wasn't a rejection. It was an invitation to the next stage of the process, an endorsement of the dream I had fought so hard to realize. But I had never seen this paper. I had spent weeks in a state of panicked despair, believing the Postal Service had failed me, or worse, that I wasn't good enough to even be tracked. Then I saw the second piece of paper clipped to the back. It was a simple lined sheet from a legal pad, my father's stationery. In his rigid, authoritarian handwriting, he had scrawled a single sentence that felt like a jagged blade to my throat. "She'll thank me later. Below that sentence, as if to turn a personal betrayal into a formal execution of my future, was a second signature, a witness, Travis Whitlock. I sat there on the floor of that sweltering attic, the air suddenly feeling thin. The realization hit me with the force of a physical assault. My father hadn't just ignored my dreams. He had actively conspired to murder them. He had intercepted my mail, opened my private correspondence, and along with my brother had physically destroyed my first application to ensure I would stay trapped in the woman's place he had designed for me. They had watched me cry. They had watched me scramble and stay up until 3 a.m. redoing months of work in a single week. They had sat across the dinner table from me, passing the salt, and asking about my day, all while knowing they had tried to sabotage my entire life. Travis, the brother I had looked up to, had signed his name to my failure. He had helped our father bury my future in a tin box so they could keep their warfighter legacy exclusive to the men. The quiet storm inside me didn't just roar then, it turned into a freezing, calculated rage. Every hardship I had faced at Annapolis, every return to sender stamp, every moment I felt I had to work twice as hard to prove my worth, it all started here. My own blood had been my first enemy. They didn't want me to protect the country. They wanted to protect their fragile egos from the shame of a daughter who was stronger than the sun. I carefully folded the letter and the note, tucking them into the inner pocket of my jacket. I didn't scream. I didn't break anything. I simply walked out of that house and locked the door behind me. My father thought he was doing me a favor. He thought that by breaking my spirit early, he would save me from a world he didn't think I belonged in. But he didn't realize that by trying to burn my bridge to the future, he had only provided the fire I needed to forge myself into something unbreakable. The betrayal was complete. But so was my resolve. As I drove away from Jacksonville, I knew that the next time I saw my father and brother, it wouldn't be as a daughter or a sister seeking approval. It would be as a commander who had survived their best ambush. The golden chandeliers of the Naval Academy ballroom seemed to dim as my father's words hung in the air like poison gas, a failure of a daughter who never learned her place. He stood there holding the microphone with a triumphant smirk, convinced he had finally put me in my place in front of the most influential people in my life. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could see the pity in the eyes of my bridesmaids and the awkward downward glances of the civilian guests. For a heartbeat, I was that 13-year-old girl again standing in the backyard in Jacksonville, being told my dreams were a joke. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I felt Ethan's hand on my shoulder, steady and warm, but I didn't need to be held up. I stood perfectly still, my spine a pillar of Navy steel. I looked directly at my father, not with tears, but with a cold, piercing clarity. He thought he had won. He thought he had unmasked me. Then the silence was shattered. The heavy oak double doors at the back of the ballroom didn't just open, they hit the walls with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. The jazz band stopped mid-note, the saxophone dying in a pathetic whine. A phalanx of men moved into the room. They weren't in tuxedos or casual suits. They were in full-dress blues, their chests a vibrant tapestry of silver stars, bronze stars, and purple hearts. At the lead was Master Chief Logan Mercer, his face a mask of weathered granite. Behind him streamed nearly 200 men, active-duty SEALs, grizzled veterans, and elite operators I had served with, from the Horn of Africa to the Persian Gulf. One of the younger officers, a lieutenant whose life I had literally pulled out of the Somali surf, stepped forward. He snapped to attention with such force his heels clicked like a hammer hitting a firing pin. His voice exploded through the ballroom, vibrating the very crystal in the chandeliers. "Admiral on deck." The effect was instantaneous and electric. Every uniformed officer in the room, from the ensigns to the captains, didn't just stand, they catapulted to attention. The sound of 200 chairs pushing back at once was like a wave crashing against the shore. My father's smirk vanished. He looked around, bewildered, still clutching the microphone as if it could protect him. He watched in stunned silence as the most dangerous men on the planet formed a corridor of honor. Then, as if choreographed by a single soul, all 200 of them raised their right hands in a crisp, synchronized salute. They weren't saluting the flag. They weren't saluting the groom. They were saluting me. Logan Mercer walked to the center of the floor, his eyes locked on my father with a terrifying intensity. He didn't need a microphone. His voice, honed by decades of shouting over gunfire and jet engines, filled every corner of the hall. "Captain Whitlock." Logan said, his voice dripping with a disdain that made my father flinch. "You just spent 5 minutes telling this room what kind of woman your daughter is. Now let me tell you what kind of officer she is." He gestured to the sea of SEALs standing at attention. "Half the men standing in this room are breathing today because of Commander Rachel Whitlock. She flew into hell when the real men were still debating the paperwork. She didn't just play soldier, she led us through the fire." Logan turned back to me, his expression softening into one of profound respect. "She isn't just a hero to this family, Captain. She is the gold standard of the United States Navy." My father's face went from pale to a ghostly white. He looked at the rows of elite warriors, men he had spent his entire life idolizing, and realized they were all standing in a posture of absolute submission to the daughter he had tried to erase. He was a retired captain, a man who lived for rank and protocol, and he was suddenly the lowest-ranking person in a room that belonged entirely to me. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. I simply returned the salute, the medals on my dress whites, ringing softly in the sudden respectful silence. The quiet storm had finally arrived, and for the first time in his life, Victor Whitlock was the one who was truly invisible. The reception continued after the Admiral on deck call, but my father had vanished into the shadows of the hallway, a ghost haunted by the very prestige he had coveted. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down to low murmurs and the clinking of coffee cups, Logan Mercer pulled me aside. We stood on the balcony of the Naval Academy, the cold air of the Severn River, a welcome relief against the heat of the night. "You did good tonight, Rachel," Logan said, lighting a cigar but not smoking it, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "But there's something you need to know about Victor. Something that isn't in his official jacket." I leaned against the stone railing, the weight of the day finally settling in my bones. "He hates me because I'm a woman in his world, Logan. I've known that since I was 6. Logan shook his head slowly, a grim smile playing on his lips. "It's deeper than that. He doesn't just hate that you're in his world. He hates that you're better at it than he ever was." He then told me a story that redirected the trajectory of my entire childhood trauma. In the late 1980s, long before I was born, a young, arrogant Marine captain named Victor Whitlock had requested an inter-service transfer to attempt basic underwater demolition/SEAL Bud/S training. He had arrived at Coronado with the same bluster and rigid pride he had used to rule our household. He didn't even make it to Hell Week. Logan said, the smoke from his cigar curling into the night air. "He was a performance drop. He couldn't handle the cold, or maybe he couldn't handle the fact that his rank didn't mean a damn thing to the instructors. He quit. Rang the bell in the middle of the first week of first phase." I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. All those years of hearing him talk about the elite, about warfighter standards, and about how women lacked the intestinal fortitude for special operations. It was all a projection. "He lied to your mother," Logan continued. "He told everyone he withdrew because of a medical disqualification, a bad knee, or some other face-saving nonsense. He claimed he chose to stay a Marine because the Corps was more principled. But the guys who were there? We remember the quitters. We remember the ones who talked big on the beach and folded in the surf." The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with a sickening crunch. My father didn't hate the military. He worshipped it with the desperation of a man who had been cast out of its inner sanctum. He had spent his life building a shrine to a version of himself that didn't exist. When Travis was born, He tried to build a second chance through him. But then I came along, the domestic daughter, and I didn't just participate in that world. I conquered it. Every time I came home with a new medal, every time I was promoted ahead of my peers, I wasn't just his daughter succeeding. I was a living, breathing reminder of his greatest failure. Every stripe on my sleeve was a mirror reflecting the moment he rang that brass bell in Coronado and walked away. "He couldn't accept you, Rachel," Logan said, turning to look at me, "because your existence makes his lie impossible to maintain. He told you women don't last in special operations because if a woman could do it, then his own failure wouldn't be because the training was impossible, it would be because he was weak." I looked out at the lights of the academy, feeling a sudden sharp surge of pity for the man who had tried so hard to break me. His cruelty wasn't born of strength or Marine discipline. It was born of a fragile, wounded ego that had been bleeding for 30 years. He hadn't been protecting the legacy of the military. He had been protecting a ghost. "The truth is," Logan added, "you didn't just break the glass ceiling. You broke the only thing he had left, his delusion." I realized then that my father's mockery at the wedding wasn't a show of power. It was his last desperate attempt to drag me down to the level of his own inadequacy. But as 200 SEALs stood to salute me, the world saw what he had tried to hide. He wasn't the gatekeeper of honor. He was just a man who had lost his way in the surf, watching his daughter sail past him into the storm. Exactly 1 week after the echoes of the wedding ballroom faded, I found myself walking through the labyrinthine corridors of the Pentagon. The air here was different, thick with the weight of global strategy and the silent hum of absolute authority. I had been summoned for a private briefing with the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, a 3-star admiral known for his economy of words. I stood at attention in his wood-paneled office, my reflection sharp in the polished glass of the windows overlooking the Potomac. The admiral didn't make me wait. He looked up from a leather-bound folder, his eyes weary but respectful. "Commander Whitlock." He began, his voice a steady baritone. "The promotion board finished their final review last night. Your record in Somalia, combined with your strategic leadership at NSWC, has made the decision unanimous. The Secretary of the Navy has officially sent your name to the Senate." He paused, a small knowing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Congratulations. You've been nominated for the rank of Rear Admiral Lower Half. You'll be one of the youngest flag officers in the history of this branch." The room seemed to tilt for a second. Admiral. It was a word that carried the weight of centuries. "This information is currently classified as close hold until the official public announcement next month," he added, shaking my hand. "But I wanted you to hear it from me first. You've earned this, Rachel." As I walked out of the Pentagon and into the crisp morning air, a sudden jarring realization hit me. Because the news was still a closely guarded secret, my father had possessed no idea of the magnitude of my success when he took that microphone at my wedding. When he called me a failure of a daughter, he thought he was punching down at a mere commander. He had no clue he was insulting a future flag officer of the United States Navy, a woman who would soon hold the authority to move entire carrier strike groups. He had tried to humiliate me at my lowest perceived point, unaware that I was already standing on the summit. I stood in the parking lot looking up at the massive concrete fortress of the Pentagon, and I felt a strange, profound peace wash over me. For 20 years, I had been a quiet storm fueled by the desperate need to prove him wrong, to force him to see me. But in that moment, the need vanished. I realized that true recognition often arrives exactly when you stop hunting for it. I had spent my life seeking his validation, only to find that the world had already given me something much greater: my own respect. I didn't need him to tell me I was a hero. The Navy, the SEALs, and the stars on my future shoulders had already spoken. The storm had passed. What was left was the steel. 3 months later, the air at the Washington Navy Yard was sharp and clear, carry the scent of the Anacostia River and the weight of history. The auditorium was a sea of white uniforms and polished brass filled with hundreds of sailors, high-ranking officials, and battle-hardened operators. This wasn't a wedding ballroom. This was a sanctuary of service. The master of ceremonies stepped to the lectern, his voice echoing against the high ceilings. As my name and new title were read aloud, the entire room, every captain, every master chief, every civilian dignitary rose as one. The sound of their movement was a thunderous rhythmic snap. They stood at attention, a living wall of respect, their eyes fixed on me as I stepped toward the center of the stage. That's when I saw him. In the very back row, far away from the VIP seating and the cameras, stood Victor Whitlock. He looked older than he had at the wedding. The harsh fluorescent lights caught the deep lines on his face, lines carved by years of rigid pride and the weight of the secrets Logan had revealed to me. He wasn't the booming, mocking antagonist of my childhood anymore. He looked like a man standing in the wreckage of his own illusions. He stood perfectly straight, his shoulders back in the posture of the Marine he had once been. For a long minute we locked eyes across the vast expanse of the hall. No words were exchanged. The silence between us was filled with the ghosts of 30 years, the intercepted letters, the quiet storm, the kitchen chores, and the return to sender stamps. Then slowly and with a deliberate, trembling precision, my father raised his right hand. He didn't do it because a protocol officer told him to. He didn't do it because the room was watching. In the absolute silence of that moment, Victor Whitlock delivered a sharp, crisp salute. It was the first time in my life he had ever looked at me and seen a peer. It was the first time he had ever acknowledged that the girl he tried to break had become the leader he could never be. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a reconciliation. It was a surrender. He was finally acknowledging the rank, the grit, and the soul of the officer standing before him. I held my salute back to the room, but my heart held that single gesture from the back row. I had waited my entire life for his approval, only to realize that by the time I finally received it, I no longer needed it to be whole. I was Rachel Whitlock, Rear Admiral of the United States Navy, and my value had never been his to define. If you are listening to this story and have ever had to choose between the expectations of your family and the truth of your own path, please share your journey in the comments. Your story might be the light someone else needs to find their way out of the dark. If this story reminded you that your worth is not decided by those who doubt you, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Let them know that their quiet storm is enough. And if you want to hear more stories of resilience, of those who rose from contempt to command, subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for the next video. Your support keeps these stories alive.